It was billed as Small Boats Week, a series of government announcements designed to show progress on the key political issue of cross-channel migration. But the reality of the last 7 days has been somewhat different. A barge moored off the Dorset coast that was brought in to house asylum seekers had to be emptied after potentially harmful bacteria was found. A blame game's now underway over who knew what and when.
It may be the council notify the Home Office. That's an issue for those in the Home Office to respond to. Obviously, this is a Home Office lead. My understanding from colleagues in the Home Office is it was notified to Home Office ministers on Thursday, and they then took very quick action as a result.
Thursday saw the highest daily number of people crossing the Channel this year, and Saturday brought the sad news of 6 deaths after a migrant ship got into trouble off the French coast. I'm Rob Powell, and for today's Sky News Daily, we'll be talking to Peter Walsh from the Migration Observatory at Oxford University. But first, I've got Amanda Akass, political correspondent for Sky News, in the studio here with me now. Amanda, nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's talk about the Bibby Stockholm first. So it was last Monday that people were first put on this, and I guess this was sort of billed as, a symbolic moment where the government was sort of projecting its hardline policies on migration. But then on Friday, it didn't quite go to plan. All of the people that were on there had to be taken off. Can you take us a little bit through the timeline of what happened between Monday and Friday? Because those tests results for Legionella first came back on Monday, didn't they?
The timeline is quite complicated, and we're still not 100% sure about all of it. I think that's fair to say. So the initial tests were actually carried out nearly 2 weeks before, so on the 25th of July. And yeah, as you say, the results came back to Dorset Council, who have responsibility for environmental health and safety, on the Monday. They say they told the contractor. And then there was a meeting on the Tuesday in which they say Home Office officials or an official were present, and so they were informed verbally then. The Home Office have been indicating they've got no record of that. Then it was on the Wednesday that the UK Health Security Agency were informed, and the Home Office were given written notification, we're told. And then on the Thursday, there was actually a meeting between all the relevant agencies concluding that no one else should be moved onto the barge. And as you say, on the Friday, they decided to move out those 39 people. We asked the Prime Minister's official spokesperson what happened, what was going on in the Home Office, and they say, well, we're still clarifying about exactly who knew what when. And so it seems to be a case here of ministers trying to dump the blame on their officials a little bit.
And thought today?
Absolutely.
Not the first time,
No, quite. But fundamentally, the Home Office has responsibility for it. They're the ones that have been pushing this from the beginning. They're the ones that were telling us we're going to get those migrants on Monday after long delays. So why really was that decision taken when on Monday they knew that they didn't know that they had the results back showing there wasn't Legionella?
Feels like a very classic Whitehall blame game and buck-passing operation, doesn't it? I think, though, do you think that some of that nuance and the complexity overall will be kind of lost on voters? Because, as you pointed out, you have got the Home Office and the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister making quite a big show of this barge. And let's remember, there's only 500 people that can be put on this barge. So this is more about symbolism than practicalities. And ultimately, this was supposed to be a symbol of their migration policy. But I guess now it's a symbol of something else, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's being described as incompetence by David Davis. I mean, he's a Tory MP. Dysfunction by Tim Lawton, another one. Labour saying it's a shambles and a farce and so on. I mean, you could keep going on, couldn't you, with the adjectives, particularly on a week that the government had spun as Stop the Boats Week. They were making all these announcements about what they were going to do to stop the small boats, to show that they were delivering on that big pledge. Because let's remember, the Prime Minister himself has kind of taken personal responsibility for this by saying Stop the Boats is one of his big pledges. And then at the end of that week, we had this complete U-turn, this embarrassment of having to evacuate the boats. So as you say, it is pretty complicated, the blame game of who exactly it was. But fundamental question is, these were people, migrants in the care of the state, who ended up being exposed to Legionella for 4 days when someone at least knew that that bacteria was present. Mercifully, no one seems to have contracted anything. But then, of course, the whole deterrent effect, the whole purpose of showing strength has kind of fallen apart too, because it looks like they can't even organise to get 39 people on it, let alone 500, which is what they need to fill it. And as you say, that's still a drop in the ocean, 1% of the 50,000 or so people still waiting on the asylum backlog.
In terms of some of the other broader events that happened last week, tell us a little bit about where we are in terms of crossing numbers and where we got to last week, and whether there's anything the government can conceivably point to as a success and as evidence that actually their plan is working and they are starting to stop the boats.
Yes, well, this is another thing that was quite remarkable, given that supposedly it was Stop the Boats Week, that last week on the Thursday, but we had the confirmation on the Friday, just before we found out about the Legionella, in fact, that milestone of 100,000 people making the crossing in a small boat across the channel had been reached. Now, they've only been collecting the data since 2018. There were a few hundred or so people who began arriving before that. And of course, some people arrive and they're not detected either. So this is just the people we know about. But clearly, 100,000 is a big number. And then also on the Thursday, it was confirmed that 755 people arrived in 14 small boats, which is actually the highest number for the whole of this year so far. Now, that's still a bit lower than last year. We saw figures nearly 1,300. But obviously, that is a big number of people. So for the government to be showing, well, we're making progress, we've got a grip on this, we are delivering on this promise, that's quite difficult to square that. I mean, they're adamant that actually they believe their policies are having an effect because they're saying, well, actually, overall, the numbers are down on last year. So a suggestion is about 15% down year on year so far. Having said that, it's a bit of a hostage to fortune to make these kind of claims because it's very weather dependent as well. And it doesn't really seem to be having enough of effect, particularly when we see the barge policy falling apart, the Rwanda policy clearly in stasis because we're waiting for a decision on the Supreme Court.
You talk about hostage to fortune. Is it a hostage to fortune for the government to really make a song and dance over issues like migration and small boat crossings when it can go wrong so easily? You know, how would you judge the kind of political wisdom in pushing this into the spotlight and talking about it more when actually the government's own record on this is pretty patchy as it stands?
Well, it seemed quite striking, didn't it, at the start of the year in January when Rishi Sunak made his list of 5 promises to the British people. And many of them seemed, well, how much control does he really have over growing the economy and halving inflation and stopping the boats? Now, there was a bit of sort of clarification on that. Oh, we're going to pass legislation to stop the boats. But fundamentally, what they keep repeating is we're going to stop the boats. Didn't say when exactly by or exactly what they meant by that. But that's a big promise to make that clearly Labour are going to keep repeating back at them, and the British public are going to look and see these numbers continuing to go up and up. So I think to a degree there is a political value to them in terms of their message to their core voters. But yeah, as you say, real risk to it because it's really clearly something that at the moment they're not really delivering on.
It's really similar to some of those Brexit battles, isn't it, where I think the kind of political strategy was behind it when we were going through the Supreme Court cases and the prorogation of Parliament and things like that. Even though the measures practically weren't working, the political strategy was basically, if we can show voters we are moving heaven and earth to try and do this, even if we don't manage to do it, then voters will give us credit for really pulling some hardline, controversial strings to try and get this done. And also, we can try and point the finger of blame at Labour, at the courts for stopping this. Right, Amanda, stay there. We're going to come back to you for more of the politics of all of this in a minute. But I wanted to bring in Peter Walsh from the Migration Observatory at Oxford University to talk about some of the overall numbers, but also to talk about the government saying that things like the Bibby barge act as a deterrent. And if we start on that, Peter, thanks for being here to start off with. Is
pleasure.
there any evidence that deterrents, domestic deterrents like the barge off the Dorset coast, whether that message actually makes it through to people attempting these journeys and really works in cutting the number of people and the number of small boats overall?
So academics have looked at exactly this question, and they've tended to find that deterrence policies of the kind that the UK government has been pursuing, the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, the Illegal Migration Act, the Rwanda policy, and accommodating people on barges, the evidence shows that they tend not to have a big impact on asylum or irregular migration. And I think the main reason for that is that actually people would be irregular entrants, asylum seekers do not have a detailed knowledge of the policies that await them on arrival. And without that knowledge, obviously these policies cannot have a deterrent effect. There is one caveat, though, which I will say, which is that a lot of this research evidence is based on policies that have been pursued by European countries like Australia, And the policies that these countries have implemented are not as restrictive. They're not quite as radical as what the UK government has proposed with the Illegal Migration Act and the Rwanda policy. So there is that caveat there. So could it have a deterrent effect? Yes. The evidence suggests historically they don't have a big impact.
What do you think the reason for them is then? Is it sort of symbolism? Is it politics?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a big political part to this. The British public in general, there's pretty widespread opposition to small boat arrivals. And remember, this is a government that had campaigned to leave the European Union on taking back control of the border. And this is why this has become such a political issue for the government, and perhaps why Rishi Sunak has staked his political reputation on it, because this is a very visible sign of a lack of control over the border.
Is there any evidence of what might work, as in looking to other countries and how they've approached the issue of irregular migration? We know that there's a lot of money and a new deal that's been made between the UK and France to increase border patrols. Is that the most realistic way of stopping people to get into boats, just stop them leaving France in the first place?
Yeah, that is one way. I mean, the evidence from other countries, and Australia is the clearest example of this, shows that physical interception of boats, it actually works. And you'll recall that Australia had this offshoring policy. It sent asylum seekers arriving by boat without authorization to Papua New Guinea and Nauru. But Australia hasn't offshored anyone to those places since 2014. Yet it has seen a very substantial drop-off in people arriving by boat, from the 20s of thousands now to just the tens. And the reason for that, I would argue, is because they've been intercepting boats at sea. Of course, these are large boats, so it's possible to do that, and then escorting them back to the territorial waters of the countries of departure. And they do that with the agreement of those countries, so Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Vietnam. So I think physical interception, there is evidence that is effective.
We've heard calls from some Tory MPs for essentially that to be done here, the so-called pushback policy. What are the differences, though, why it hasn't made it into action here? In terms of, is this about getting agreement to do that with the French? Is this about the lack of international waters at the narrowest point in the channel as well? Why do you think that hasn't made it into reality?
So it's nothing to do with a lack of international waters in the English Channel. It does need French cooperation. And the French argue that it's about these small boats, that in the case of Australia, they were big boats, they were ships. They were able to be turned back. All people were able to be escorted off and then transferred back. And the French argue that this is just not possible with these small boats, and that actually the safest thing to do is to immediately get people off and then take them either to the UK or back to France. But there's some scepticism about that. I recall, the Home Affairs Select Committee, they asked the question, well, could the French be doing more to intercept boats in the water? There is an issue there, which is that, okay, let's say we intercept the boats in the water, the French take people back to France, or they prevent people from leaving the shores, and they do that actually. But then what happens to these individuals? They're detained, not indefinitely. At some point they're released, and the French, not being able to return them to their countries of origin, therefore allow them to continue their onward journeys, to try again. And that's one of the issues here too.
In terms of the numbers, the government talks of overall small boat crossings. We saw at the tail end of last week the total cross 100,000 people who have arrived on small boat crossings, on small boats across the Channel. I mean, is that a fairly arbitrary number? Does that have any significance beyond sort of symbolism?
So it is an arbitrary number, of course, but in another sense, not so arbitrary. It's a round number and it's a big number. But I think you're right. It's largely symbolic because it's a very clear sign that this is a form of migration the government does not have control over.
So it's a bit early, really, for the government to be kind of claiming credit, because we had Rishi Sunak, I think, about 2 months ago at the beginning of June, conveniently before the summer months started and the boat crossings tend to pick up, saying that whilst border crossings and irregular migration into other European continental countries was up, the numbers coming into the UK were down, and saying that this was evidence that his policies were working. Is it too soon to say that?
Now, when Rishi Sunak announced that the policy was working, there was a 20% difference. Numbers were down 20% on last year. That's already narrowed to 10%. I suggested it was too early to say then, and I think it's probably too early to say now. But there is also a statistical challenge, which it's very difficult to escape, which is we don't have access to the counterfactual, what would have happened had the policies not been implemented. And by the way, large parts of them, like Rwanda, haven't been implemented yet. So it's certainly too early to say, because that's the big part of the deterrent policy. But the fact is that boat arrivals, they fluctuate for all sorts of reasons, most of which are unrelated to policy. It's actually, in statistical terms, really difficult to disentangle the deterrent impact of policy from all of these other drivers, like conditions in countries of origin, conditions on transit routes, the activity of smuggling operations, and so on.
It's fascinating, isn't it? There's just so many variables. And I guess when you sort of start sticking something with so many variables through the kind of mincemeter of politics, you just end up with politicians trying to claim credit for one thing and trying to distance themselves from something else, even if there is absolutely no solid links between them. Peter, thanks so much. We'll take a quick break now, and when we're back, we'll be speaking to our political correspondent again about some of the issues the government has chosen to focus on this summer, and whether shining a spotlight on those issues could potentially backfire for Rishi Sunak. So our political correspondent Amanda Akass is still here in the studio with me. Amanda, it's been a pretty busy summer government-wise. You know, you usually find sort of ministers and MPs slinking off to the beaches over summer and everything going quite quiet. But there has been this sort of steady drumbeat of announcements and spotlights shone on various policy areas by the government. I think initially we had Housing Week, then we had Energy Week, now we've got Small Boats Week, now we're on to Health Week. What do you think's going on? What's the government trying to do here?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, as you say, last year we had the Tory leadership campaign, so that was extremely busy.
We thought a lifetime ago.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I know. Remember that, Rishi versus Liz? But we thought that this year would be quieter. Rishi Sunak, of course, off to California. But I think what the Conservatives have really decided to do is that they know how far they are behind in the polls with Labour. And really, yes, the Prime Minister has been doing his best this year since he took power in that very chaotic circumstances following Liz Truss's fairly disastrous mini budget and everything that happened there. He's been trying to steady the ship, to show that he's a responsible, safe pair of hands, that he's hardworking. But I think we've got a growing restlessness from many of his backbenchers, particularly over this issue of immigration. And I think to a degree, many of the backbenchers want to see more fight and more fire. They want to see the Tory party hitting out at Labour. It's not really good enough to say, look, we're trying to run the country, we're trying to improve the economy, the situation is difficult, but look at these kind of things that we have achieved. They need to really be taking the fight to Labour because they're so far behind in the polls. It's the only chance they've got in a way.
But it strikes me as a risk. Say this week they're talking about the NHS, and we had Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, kind of somewhat provocatively writing to Labour-run Wales, the NHS there, and the SNP-run Scottish NHS, and saying, look, if you guys want any help cutting your waiting list, why don't you come and talk to us in England? I mean, that seems like a remarkable thing to do, given in the last few days, we've had NHS leaders in England warning that we're basically at a tipping point, and if strikes carry on, they won't be able to meet the Prime Minister's pledge of cutting waiting lists. We've still got junior doctors out on strike in English hospitals at the moment. That has been settled with the BMA in Scotland. It sort of reminds me of, I remember the fictional Downing Street spin doctor Malcolm Tucker once saying to his opposite number, no one talks about dodgy donors because it makes us all look bad. Is that a risk for the government that in putting attention on something like the NHS and trying to attack Labour and the SNP in Scotland and Wales for waiting lists, it just draws attention to the failures in England, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it certainly takes a bit of political chutzpah, doesn't it, to kind of make that claim. But they're just trying to muddy the waters here, really. I think it's quite interesting that this is happening this summer, because I think if Parliament was sitting and we had PMQs, I mean, these are kind of topics that both sides rip each other apart on. But actually, it almost feels like the government on the airways, they feel that they can sort of make these points. And Labour, I think, sometimes are slightly struggling to hit back in these positions because they're doing their best to kind of stick to their core messages and trying not to get too drawn into these kind of arguments.
What do you make of Labour's response in the last week on migration? Because I guess part of the aim is to put Sir Keir Starmer in a position where he's forced to answer whether he would keep the Bibi Stockholm barge or not, whether he would keep the Rwanda policy or not. Because whichever way he goes on that, he risks annoying the left of his party and core Labour supporters that think that Labour should be running a mile from policies like this. But of course, Sir Keir Starmer's got an eye on the voters that he wants to win back at the next election as well.
Well, I think for Sir Keir Starmer, it's getting real, really. I think that is probably the best way of putting it. I think in terms of what he's been saying and Labour positioning, being so careful in a way not to answer some of these questions is because they're so focused on what will happen if they do win power in just over a year's time, as we're expecting the election to be. They don't want to promise anything that they're not going to be able to deliver on, because that's what they want to do, show that they have integrity, and they want to say all of our policies are fully funded. But we heard Peter Kyle, Shadow Northern Ireland Minister, really being asked, well, would you ditch the Bibby.com? You think it's such a debacle? Wouldn't you get rid of it if you're in power? And they wouldn't answer that question. They just wouldn't give a straight answer, asked repeatedly. And it is quite frustrating, I think, for voters to say, well, this is a straight question. Would you or wouldn't you? And I think the answer has to be, well, no, they wouldn't. They're not committing to do that.
Yeah, it does feel like on immigration or strikes or whatever, the kind of stock policy response from Labour is a bit like that joke of someone asking for directions and the other person saying, well, I wouldn't start here. And like, it might be accurate, but it's not very helpful, is it? I guess the argument Labour are making is just about competency, isn't it? And whilst at the moment, because so much stuff is going wrong in various sectors, it's quite an effective argument to make. In 12 months' time, if inflation is back down to near target, if small boat crossings have stopped a little bit, if the NHS is in a better shape, it's a lot harder to make an argument about competency if it looks like the government is actually starting to fix problems. We shall see.
Yes, indeed. And there's that quote about Tony Blair carrying the Ming vase across the floor and not wanting to drop it sort of when you're so far ahead in the polls and you don't want to mess it up just beforehand. And I think that was very much the position Sir Keir Starmer's in.
Amanda Akass, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's Daily. Thanks to Amanda and thanks to, of course, to Peter Walsh. If you want to find out more, head to the Sky News website or the app. I've been writing about the government's focus on small boats and housing and energy and health and how that could potentially backfire for them. But thanks for listening and see you next time.